Apologise for the background noise. I'd rather have a frontal lobotomy than have a bottle in front of me. I amuse myself. An etiquette teacher once told me you should never introduce yourself with an apology. But as is so often the case when I meet new people, I have to apologise for my face. I'm in the middle of some quite intensive dental work, and I'm missing a couple of teeth. I hope it's not too distracting. Don't eat my microphone. It was very expensive. It cost more than you did. But today, we are talking about PAWS. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends. Welcome to Bad Country. You quite finished? The biggest mistake that most of us make when we first get sober is to assume that now we've put down the bottle, the hardest part is over. But then for weeks or months or even years, weird symptoms begin to return, like brain fog and mood swings and irritability, insomnia and depression. Strange new neuroses appear from out of nowhere. For me, most recently, I've developed vertigo every time I step into an elevator. I think I've mentioned that before. I don't know where that came from. But I would say that while I agree that the worst attributes of our addiction are over once we put down the bottle, that's not the hardest part. The worst is not the same as the hardest, and PAWS might be the hardest part of getting sober and maintaining sobriety. PAWS is Post-Acute Withdrawal Syndrome, the name given to a kind of complex of symptoms that some of us experience in the early stages of recovery from alcoholism and other addictions. Think of it like a second stage of withdrawal. The first stage is the addictive substance actually leaving your body and the immediate effects of that. And PAWS is a delayed second wave of mostly emotional and psychological psychiatric symptoms, resulting from the changing neurochemical processes of your dumb human brain. Today we're going to look at definitions of post-acute withdrawal syndrome, its duration, common symptoms to look out for. Then we're going to get a little bit sciencey, talking about the neurochemical processes that lead to PAWS and the neurobiology behind it. And then we'll talk about whether or not you have it. And then we'll talk about managing some coping strategies if you think that you do have it. But before we talk about whether or not you have it, let's tackle something up front. Is post-acute withdrawal syndrome actually real? Is it a recognised condition? And if any of this content has any value to you at all, then please do leave a subscription. I mean, subscriptions don't really mean very much on YouTube, but they're very good for my self-esteem, so thank you in advance. So, is PAWS real? Well, there is a little bit of debate about PAWS as a unique condition. And I think that perhaps the biggest problem with PAWS is its name. When the name of a medical condition produces a very cute acronym like PAWS or like SAD, which is seasonal affective disorder, we have a tendency to believe that the entire condition is just made up. If it has a cute name, then perhaps there isn't much substance to the science. But PAWS is not made up. It is real. It just happens to have a cute acronym. It does not have its own entry in the DSM-5, the Manual for Psychiatric Disorders. But it is widely accepted by specialists and clinicians, especially in addiction medicine. It is an established condition. It's just not very often given a specific diagnosis. And the reason for that we'll get to in just a moment. There is plenty of clinical evidence for post-acute withdrawal syndrome to support it as being a condition in its own right. It's a little bit like the G-spot. We all know it's real, and the only people who doubt its existence probably don't have much first-hand experience with it. Its existence is borne out through MRI and PET scans, and these scans reveal reduced dopamine function in the period following immediate withdrawal. And most of us who have gone through difficult withdrawal and got sober have experienced it firsthand. I certainly experienced PAWS, and I can testify to its existence as at least a name that we can give to a collection of symptoms in early sobriety. The few studies specifically into PAWS show plainly that brain chemistry can take months and even years to find its equilibrium again once we've been screwing it up with substances for so long. And that process of rebalancing the brain involves very long lingering withdrawal symptoms. To this day, even after a couple of years of sobriety, I wonder if I'm slightly anhedonic, because I still find it difficult to be excited or disappointed like I was before the booze got on top of me. My peaks aren't as high as they used to be, and the troughs aren't quite as low. I exist on a kind of flat plateau of general grumpiness. That is my default state now. The reason why there's debate about whether or not PAWS is a distinct diagnosis in its own right is because it's not very well defined. In fact, it's not even very consistently studied. And the reason for that is because addiction comes with a lot of the same underlying mental health issues as the symptoms experienced in PAWS. And that kind of muddies the water. So for example, I was given a diagnosis of PTSD, major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety before I even got sober. So it should be no surprise that those symptoms once again presented themselves in post-acute withdrawal syndrome. It's very hard to diagnose which is which. Like, did one cause the other? Are they separate entities? And that's why there's rarely a diagnosis of PAWS, even though most clinicians will agree that it exists. It's difficult to untangle the mess that most of us were that drove us to drink or use drugs in the first place from the resultant PAWS. So how common is post-acute withdrawal syndrome? Well, very. It's very, very common. It's common to the point where if you are in recovery and you did not experience PAWS, you are the exception. 90% of people recovering from opioid addiction will experience PAWS. 80 to 90% of people recovering from benzodiazepine addiction will experience PAWS, and something more than 75% of recovering alcoholics will also experience PAWS. So it's most of us, basically. Most of us will either get it or have had it or have it right now. And it's one of those compounding, ironic features of recovery from addiction that make it so hard to break out of. Because those of us who are experiencing or have experienced post-acute withdrawal syndrome are 4 times more likely to relapse than people who don't experience it. And also, there is a higher prevalence of suicide in the first year of sobriety for people who have experienced post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Continuing with some statistics, post-acute withdrawal syndrome is most severe between the 3rd and 6th months, or like the first 6 months of sobriety. But the effects can last up to 2 years. It certainly dragged its feet with me. But what about the other more common symptoms of PAWS? Do you have any of these? As I said, it's hard to untangle what is post-acute withdrawal syndrome and what is a pre-existing mental health condition. But for me, and my experience was largely in line with the research and the studies that have been done, PAWS was mostly characterized first and foremost by brain fog. Quite more intense than the kind of brain fog that you might have experienced if you have a pre-existing depressive disorder. This was something profound brain fog was the worst of all the symptoms that I experienced. It was absolutely comprehensive. The feeling of having a heavy head, like physically, and the complete inability to think clearly or make decisions or process information. Just never really waking up in the morning. And then being unable to concentrate and not being able to read a line of information, having to read it over and over again before it went in. That was the big one for me. That was the difference between what I think was PAWS and what I think was the pre-existing mental health issues that I had, was the brain fog. That cleared up in time. I'll tell you what I did to get rid of that. Other common symptoms which I also experienced were depression, constant depression, and a lack of motivation, a complete sense of pessimism, no hope, hopelessness. I'd say bundled with that for me was anhedonia, the complete inability to feel any joy or pleasure. And maybe anhedonia is just a normal part of depression, but this felt like something different, and it still does. It's more like the inability to experience peaks and troughs. So anhedonia for me was characterized not just by the lack of an ability to experience joy, but also to fully experience the lows and the disappointment too. It was just flat, gloomy mood for a very long period. Anxiety is another common symptom, extending even as far as panic attacks. For me, the earliest stages of withdrawal, that is to say, mine was pretty bad, including delirium tremens, but it was a constant state of panic attack. And the withdrawal period for me was one long anxiety attack with hallucinations and all of that stuff that I've talked about in previous videos. But if your anxiety is heightened even after the initial withdrawal period is finished, if you're experiencing surges of anxiety, that might be a signifier that what you're actually experiencing is post-acute withdrawal syndrome. Fatigue was a major one. Again, fatigue tends to come with major depressive disorder, in my experience. But again, it was a fatigue that was just not... I never felt rested. And with that comes a complete lack of motivation. When you wake up tired, it's difficult to get started. And you have no energy to get anything accomplished. In fact, leads me to the next one, sleep. Your sleep will be disturbed for a very long time. And any deep sleep that you do get may well be accompanied by really weird dreams, particularly dreams about alcohol. It took me about 8 months of sustained sobriety to stop dreaming about alcohol and to dream about getting caught being drunk or dreaming about hiding alcohol and that kind of thing. Mood swings and emotional instability. I have to say, I don't think I really had this myself. My experience was just a very gloomy plateau, as I said. I was just grumpy and depressed the whole time, so my moods didn't swing so much. But most people, or a lot of people, report swinging from kind of mania to depression, or at least happiness to sadness, or aggression. And these symptoms, they are unpredictable. They will come and go. They don't really have any particular triggers for them. Very unpredictable. They can appear without any particular cause or reason. And there's also a craving to drink in PAWS. And it comes in waves, and it's more than an intrusive thought. It's a real bona fide urge. More like a sense that your body is missing something. So those are largely the most commonly reported symptoms of post-acute withdrawal syndrome. So now, let's talk about the science. I am no scientist, in fact no expert, don't claim to be an expert in anything, really. But I guess for the sake of comprehensiveness, I know words, then it would be good to include it. So what's going on in the brain during post-acute withdrawal syndrome? When you use addictive substances for prolonged periods of time, the chemistry of your brain undergoes dramatic changes. And neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and glutamate become imbalanced as your central nervous system fights with itself to restore some kind of balance, equilibrium. There are neurochemical changes and effects. For a long time, while you've been drinking, alcohol has been providing much of your dopamine for however long you've been drinking, to the point that your central nervous system is probably dependent on alcohol for the entirety of your dopamine function. And now you've suddenly removed it. It's suddenly gone. And your central nervous system is kind of not forgotten, but it is panicking in order to restore a sense of equilibrium. Your brain and your central nervous system have gone into overdrive in order to find that balance again. And it can take months and months for it to restore that balance, or to become accustomed to this new kind of status quo in your body. Chronic substance use disrupts the brain's reward system, making it difficult to experience pleasure in everyday activities. And that means that even normal, positive experiences may not feel as rewarding in early recovery. And that was certainly, and is still, my experience. Another major factor, as far as your brain is concerned, in the governance of alcohol withdrawal and your body's response to it, your prefrontal cortex is an incredibly important component. That's the part of the brain that is largely responsible for things like impulse control, emotional regulation, decision making. Prolonged substance use and abuse, particularly alcohol, has a direct impact on your prefrontal cortex. And that has a knock-on effect on all of your decision-making and your impulse control and your decision-making. And the effect is not a good one. The damage that alcohol has done to your brain, particularly your prefrontal cortex, your frontal lobe, makes it very difficult to quit. And it makes it a lot harder to manage the stress and the emotional complexity and the suppression of urges that come in early sobriety. And if your decision-making and your impulse control is impaired, you can imagine how hard it is to convince yourself that you don't want to drink anymore. And that's further compounded by, if you have a pre-existing prefrontal lobe injury, as I do, then it becomes even harder. And I think that we are more vulnerable to severe post-acute withdrawal syndrome than the general population. And it would do you good to really think about your own history and try to remember if you've ever had any serious bangs on the head, or if you've ever lost consciousness, or if you've had a lot of concussions, because a lot of that can have an impact on your frontal lobe. I read a study somewhere, I don't have it to hand and I wish I remembered it, but it was about how brain injuries are more common in the prison population. And not because prisoners have necessarily lived more dangerous or violent lives, but because frontal lobe injuries are more likely to reduce your impulse control. It's more likely to make you engage in criminal and addictive behaviour. And I wonder if that's true across all addicts. So if you are aware that you've had a head injury, let us know in the comments. I want to know again how common this is. Okay, so the brain, what post-acute withdrawal syndrome really is the brain recalibrating itself after a long period of addiction, leading to an extended period of emotional and cognitive instability. And that's to be expected. That's why recovery takes time. It has to rebuild and, in a sense, rewire itself. Think of it like a broken bone. You don't just remove the cast after you've recovered from a broken bone and then go and run a marathon. There is still healing to be done. The brain, much like the body, takes time to recover, and PAWS is part of that healing process. Now, if you have ever broken a major bone in your body, you might be familiar with that that really uncomfortable feeling of the bone kind of knitting itself back together. That's what your brain is doing in pause. But instead of the physical pain of a broken bone repairing itself, the pain we experience as the brain mends itself is mostly emotional. Pause is that process of recovery, and it takes time. So, how much time does it take? What is the pause timeline? Well, let's assume that you are out of the initial acute withdrawal period. You're going to experience pause very severely for the first 2 months or so. That's going to be all of the insomnia, all of the depression, all of the brain fog. They will peak and fluctuate, but for about 2 months, that's when this particular part of the condition really peaks. Then for the next 3 to 6 months after that, you'll see a gradual kind of improvement with occasional flare-ups, where you might have glimpses of mood stability or even happiness, contentment. And then over the following 6 to 12 months, most of the symptoms will begin to decline and fade out. The triggers will cause you some temporary setbacks. And I would argue that the brain fog, at least for me, lasted quite a long time. But in the first year, you should see your symptoms improve. And at some point towards the end of this process, and I'm at this point right now, we have to acknowledge that this state might be our new reality. This might be our new normal. And things might never be like they were before we had a problem. We have done a lot of damage. And it's unrealistic to think we can experience the full spectrum of life and human emotion the same as we did before. We might never experience the same height of highs and the same depth of lows as we did before. The trick is, for me, to find pleasure within those new limitations. And that is the subject of another video. So, by now I'm sure I've established that pause is a very long process and unpredictable. Do you have it? That's the big question. I would honestly go ahead and just assume that if you think you might have it, you probably do. It's just safer that way. And there is really no harm, as far as I can see, in assuming that you probably do have or did have post-acute withdrawal syndrome. It's not going to hurt you to think that. In the long term, the treatment is the same. Whether you're grouping all of your symptoms together and giving it the name post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or whether you're attempting to treat each individual symptom as part of its own unique condition, the treatment, the medicine is going to be the same. For now, what really matters is how you manage it. How do you make it through to the other side? So I'm going to tell you a few of the things that I found genuinely useful. Some of them align with the literature and with the research, and some of them may be unique to me. I don't know. I would like to hear from other people who have gone through it in the comments about stuff that genuinely helped them. For me, sleep. That was the game changer for me. Of all the things I got back when I got sober, I am most grateful for sleep. Sleep is hard in withdrawal, so get it whenever you can, and everything else will eventually follow from it. And for what it's worth, personally, I'm in bed by 8 p.m. almost every night, and then I'm up again at 6 a.m, and then I'm productive all day. That took practice, and I'm glad it was worth it. Did you know Cristiano Ronaldo sleeps for 3 hours every afternoon? Just saying. Food. A good diet is very important, and I include this point just because I feel obligated to, but the truth is, in withdrawal I ate crap. So do better than me. At the very least, be supplementing your diet with, whatever you need, omega-3s and all of the B vitamins that you can get your hands on, and magnesium. I also had a potassium deficiency, which would cause me to black out every now and then. So potassium supplements were useful to me. And another actual secret tip from me is, this is not sponsored naturally, but creatine. Really simple creatine from the health fitness shop. Creatine is, I think, it's not just for gym bros. It's not just for like muscle density and recovery from exercise. It has real cognitive benefits. It's also good for depression. So try creatine if you're experiencing brain fog. It really has helped me. I take it every day, and my brain has started to feel like it's working again. Next, work. Now, I never went into a long-term rehab or anything like that. I was working while I was going through withdrawal. I probably should have gone into rehab. I think it would have benefited me. I think I would have got this thing beat sooner than I did if I had gone to a longer-term kind of inpatient rehab. I certainly needed it. I didn't do it, though. In fact, I was working in the detox centre. I was answering emails from the psych ward. And that's mental. Now that I think back on that, that's craziness. But to me, work feels like progress and structure. And that was a benefit to me in post-acute withdrawal syndrome. I just kind of worked through it, knuckled down and got on with it. It's not easy to motivate yourself when you have pause to go to work, but if you have work, do it. Another, exercise. Again, an obvious one. So obvious that it's barely worth repeating, and I know that everybody says it and you're bored of hearing it, but exercise is crucial. I particularly recommend weight training. That was great for me to bring up my energy levels. I did cycling for cardio. In fact, I remember using the exercise bike in the psych ward while I was still in acute withdrawal syndrome. But taking that and taking that desire to exercise and using it in post-acute withdrawal syndrome is so important. It makes all the difference. But do whatever. You don't have to become a strongman or run a marathon. Walking is great. Anything. Stretching at home. Whatever you can do. For me, computer games were a big part of the dopamine reward system that I needed during pause, playing computer games. I personally preferred very slow, quite difficult Zen-like games like Disco Elysium was a big one, SnowRunner was fantastic. Puzzle games are also very, very good. Platformers to simple ones that are good for dopamine like Hollow Knight and Ori, the Will of the Wisps. And that was also very good. And then, of course, talking, groups, therapy. You need a place to talk about this stuff. For me, it's this YouTube channel. But for some, group therapy, AA is good. A private therapist is worth its weight in gold, especially if you can somehow get one cheaply. I know they're expensive. They're not available to everybody. But somewhere where you can talk honestly about your experience. Medication. A divisive one. I tried a lot. I was medicated quite heavily for a while, and I ended up hating it. And I'm no longer medicated at all, apart from, of course, my creatine and my caffeine. Aside from that, I recognise now that it was probably important for getting me over that hump in pause, and it may be of use to you too. I think the ultimatum that I faced was it better to spend a few months on medication that I hated if it kept me from a relapse that might ruin my life? And in the end, the medication was the right decision at that time. And then aside from that stuff, just take seriously all of the generic kind of relapse prevention advice there is out there. Journaling, exercise, diet, recognizing triggers and spotting patterns of risky behavior, going outside, playing games, eating as well as you can, practicing good sleep until it sticks, because it will eventually. The rest is up to you. Now, it's very easy to feel alone when you're wrestling with post-acute withdrawal syndrome. And it's tempting to think that no one's ever felt like you do right now. We all feel unique in that sense. We all feel like no one understands. But post-acute withdrawal syndrome is temporary. And if you're willing to work a little bit, if you're willing to put in some effort and take some responsibility for how you feel, then it is manageable and there is a way through it. And the thing about addiction is that when you make it through to the other side, eventually you do feel invincible again. And your rock bottom becomes the thing in your daily life that you can point to and use and be proud of. Because if you overcame that period of your life, nothing else can hurt you. Just give it some time. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome is the period you have to go through to achieve that sense of strength. That's it for today. In the name of like, comment, and subscribe, good luck out there.